All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition Kickoff Press Conference. My name is Dwayne Bensing, and I am on legal staff at the ACLU of Delaware. I want to welcome our press and those that are viewing along on Facebook. We've invited the press here today to ask us any questions, and so throughout our event, any questions the press may have, please put in the Q&A or the chat on the Zoom. Otherwise, to the folks watching on Facebook, welcome to this event, and we're happy that you're here. The Delaware Voting Rights Coalition is Delaware's first statewide coalition on voting rights. We're a combination of organizations and advocates, and under this umbrella of the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, we're encouraging voters and policymakers to consider reforms that will improve access to voting. We've been diligently working for the last several months, and we're ready to work with legislators, local election officials, and the Department of Elections to make sure that these reforms become a reality. We want to encourage that everyone who has the right to vote can exercise that right in a meaningful, transparent, safe, and secure manner. We support reforms that broaden access for all eligible voters to register and cast their ballots. Specifically, we support reforms that extend the voter registration deadline through Election Day, that ensure all registered voters are able to cast a mail ballot, and reforms that educate all eligible voters about the option to cast a mail or early vote ballot. We are formed in the wake of the 2020 elections. During the 2020 election, over 500,000 Delawareans voted, many, over 160,000, by absentee and mail ballots because they were granted temporary eligibility to vote by mail due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 34 other states already have permanent universal absentee eligibility. One issue many of our coalition members are focused on is the constitutional amendment expanding absentee voter eligibility here in Delaware. Leading that effort in the General Assembly is Representative David Bentz, the sponsor of House Bill 75. I will now turn it over to Representative Bentz. We're so grateful to have him joining us this morning. He's going to discuss with us why HB 75 is imperative to pass here in Delaware. Representative?
Thank you, Dwayne. And thanks everybody who's a part of this call and who's a part of this effort across the board here. This is a great coalition of parties to support expanding access to our polls and making sure everybody is able to exercise their right to vote. House Bill 75, to give a little background on it, is the second leg of a constitutional amendment in Delaware. And to provide some context for how we can amend the Constitution here in Delaware, a bill must pass twice in 2 consecutive General Assemblies with a supermajority vote. So we passed the first leg of this in 2019, and we are now working through the process of trying to pass it for the second time in this General Assembly here this year, hopefully, and to make the amendment official. What is so important about this is because the way our state constitution is written right now, it very clearly and prescriptive way outlines the exact circumstances under which somebody can vote absentee. This prevents us from going into state code to amend absentee voting law and things like that to make it more accessible and allow more people to utilize it, because the constitutional language is so restrictive. So what we want to do is be able to go in and take that out and make sure that we can have no excuse absentee voting. And not only now, but then into the future, we can look at ways to expand absentee voting and ensure some flexibility in how people exercise their right to vote. Because, I think one of the curious things about this and the way this has been handled in our Constitution is, constitutions are really intended to sort of outline and like clear the rights that are granted to everybody. And what this provision in our Constitution unfortunately does is it actually limits people's access to their right in a lot of ways by really condensing the circumstances in which they can vote. And what we want to do is obviously take that out and make sure that we have as few restrictions as possible on people's right to vote, so that they can do it in a way that is convenient for them, in a way that we've seen for years and years is safe and secure, that can be done in a way that ensures integrity in our elections and maintains people's access and maintains people's ability to exercise their right to vote the way they would like to utilize it. And 2020 election is just a great example of how many Delawareans would like to vote this way if given the opportunity to do so every cycle. It was a very popular thing for people to be able to do, and I think it's one of those things that will continue to be popular outside the context of COVID-19, as we've seen across the country as people utilize absentee voting as their primary way to vote. So it's just another in a host of policies that we're going to hopefully talk about here today and hopefully get done in the near future that I think bring Delaware's elections into the 21st century in a lot of ways and modernize them in a lot of ways and adjust to the current day in a way that allows people to vote as conveniently as possible in a way that fits their lifestyle, in a way that is safe and secure and really protects our democracy here in Delaware. So I thank everybody who supports these initiatives, and I look forward to hearing more about them from different perspectives we have here today.
Thank you, Representative Vince. As mentioned, last year when the General Assembly expanded access to absentee ballots in response to the COVID-19 crisis, Delaware saw over a 15% increase in voter participation as compared to 2016. So these reforms are really important to Delaware voters, and it's really important to our Voting Rights Coalition. Here to speak more on the personal impact that vote by mail can have on Delawarean voters, we have Maureen and John Richard. First up, Maureen Bertelson of the Middletown area to talk about vote by mail.
Hi, I'm Maureen Bertelson. I live near Middletown and reside in the 9th Representative District. I moved to Delaware in 2016 and was really surprised the first time I requested an absentee ballot that I needed an excuse to get one. I've lived in several states where I didn't need an excuse and 2 states that voted only by mail. Since we moved here from Washington, which only votes by mail, I just prefer to vote by mail now. It allows me to take my time. I don't have to worry that something unexpected could happen on election day and prevent me from voting. And also personally, I like to vote by hand-marked paper ballot rather than on a machine. I voted 3 times absentee in the state of Delaware so far. Luckily, I had an excuse each time that was approved. Once was a short vacation out of state. Another time I was working the polls, and the Department of Elections recommended we vote by absentee ballot beforehand. And the last time was because of the pandemic. And we all know, I want to know that I can choose to vote by absentee ballot whenever I want to, and not just when my circumstances align with an approved excuse. We know that voting by mail is safe and secure, and that the state of Delaware has a good system in place to handle voting by mail by absentee ballot. I believe strongly that our democracy is strengthened when more people vote, and restricting absentee voting to only those with an approved excuse seems unnecessary and unwise and prevents us from doing other things to expand the vote. I believe strongly in HB 75, and I have let my representative, Kevin Hensley, know my hopes that he will vote again for this second leg of the constitutional amendment to approve no excuse absentee voting. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I really appreciate that. And as you were just saying, we've had absentee voting in Delaware for, I think, over 80 years at this point. We know how to do it. Voters have done it, and we need to make it a permanent part of our infrastructure. Next up, we have another vote by mail advocate, John Richard with Delaware United. John Richard?
Thanks so much, Dwayne. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining our press release today. My name is John Richard Janelli, and I'm a member of the 10th RD, and I'm representing the Electoral Reform Committee from Delaware United. When I think about electoral reform, I want to refer to 2 folks who may be important to all of us. They're influential figures in American history. The first state needs to look no further for guidance on electoral reform than President Joe Biden and former President Barack Obama. Both have cited the need for the very nonpartisan electoral reforms that we're advocating for. In his final State of the Union address, Obama put it quite simply by saying it should be easier to vote, not harder. Bills like House Bill 75 benefit every citizen by empowering the core elements of our democracy. Every election year, I have friends asking me how to vote. Is it too late to vote? How do I register? When's the primary? And often enough, they're lamenting to me that they didn't get a chance to vote because of some sort of barrier that was outside of their control. Typically like registration ending, or the fact that they, maybe they're immunocompromised and during the pandemic and they couldn't go in and they just didn't get a hold of things. So, it's a Pew Research poll from 2017 indicates that a quarter of unregistered Americans say they intended to vote, but just hadn't gotten around to starting the process. And others cite that getting registered is just plain old inconvenient and they don't know how. At the end of the day, the polarization and tribalization we see growing in our politics directly correlates to the increasing notion among citizens that our electoral systems are broken, and they feel powerless to make a real change with their vote, partly because it's so hard to go ahead and cast it. Automatic voter registration and no excuse absentee voting are some of several desperately needed electoral reforms to help heal our democracy and elevate the voice of every Delawarean. Delaware United proudly stands in solidarity with the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition and House Bill 75. Thank you so much for your consideration, and back to you, Dwayne.
Thanks, John Richard. These stories are exactly why our coalition is working so hard. So I really appreciate you speaking as voters and members of our coalition organizations. Our members are vast and diverse. They include the ACLU of Delaware, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, the Gamma Theta Lambda Chapter, Common Cause Delaware, Delaware State Association of Letter Carriers, Delaware United, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the Wilmington, Delaware Alumni Chapter, League of Women Voters Delaware, Network Delaware, Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, Alpha Nu Sigma Alumni Chapter, Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice, the Unitarian Universalist Delaware Advocacy Network, and the YWCA of Delaware. As you can see, we are a broad, diverse coalition. We empower communities, especially communities of color, people who speak English as a second language, people involved in the justice system, and young people to identify and remedy the barriers to the ballot box. We have some coalition partners with us here today to discuss why this work is important to their member organizations. And first up, I want to introduce Claire Snyder Hall of Common Cause Delaware. Claire.
Thank you, Dwayne. It's great to be here today. It's a very exciting day today for the people of Delaware, launching this Voting Rights Coalition. As mentioned, I'm Claire Snyder Hall. I'm the Delaware State Director for Common Cause, which is a nonpartisan grassroots organization with 1.5 million members all over the country, including many right here in the First State. Common Cause Delaware believes that our government by the people is stronger when more people can participate in it. That's why we strongly support the freedom to vote. We want the voices of all Delawareans to be heard on Election Day. Right now in Delaware, as we've been hearing, voters are not allowed to vote by absentee ballot unless they can provide the Department of Elections with an excuse. And not just any excuse, but one of the few excuses listed in the state constitution. Common Cause Delaware does not believe the Constitution should provide barriers to voting. That defies common sense. Instead, we believe that voters should be able to decide for themselves whether or not they need to vote by absentee ballot. It should be their choice. For example, in 2020, many voters wanted to vote absentee in order to minimize their exposure to the coronavirus, but that's not a valid excuse according to the state constitution. Fortunately, the General Assembly made an emergency exception to allow people to vote absentee. Common Cause Delaware, along with the rest of the voting coalition, wants to make that option of no excuse absentee voting permanent. We learned a lot of things in 2020, some bad, some good, but one of them is this. The COVID crisis helped us all understand that today, voting in person on Election Day just doesn't work for most Americans. All over the country, other states did what Delaware did. People were allowed the freedom to vote absentee during the pandemic. and the results were phenomenal. In terms of voter participation, turnout records were broken just about everywhere. And when ballots were counted, only 30% of voters had cast an in-person ballot on election day. 30%. Here in the first state, no excuse absentee voting contributed to voter turnout that was almost 15% higher than for the 2016 presidential election. 64,000 more Delawareans participated in our government by voting. And that's a great success because in civic terms, our system of government relies on fair representation, which requires participation. Common Cause Delaware wants to expand the freedom to vote. And so we support a number of other bills that also remove barriers to voting, like automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration, both currently before the House. Consider this. In the 2020 election, more than 70% of our voting eligible population cast a ballot, which is great. However, that also means that 3 in 10 Delawareans who could have voted did not. And the biggest reason why Americans across the country don't vote is because they aren't registered. And the same is true right here in Delaware. Fortunately, that problem can be easily fixed by expanding opportunities for people to register. Bills establishing automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration will be coming to the House floor for a vote soon, and Common Cause Delaware supports them. But today, our focus is on HB 75, the No Excuse Absentee Voting Amendment. Passing that amendment will help all Delaware voters by giving us another option for how to cast our ballots. It's a small change that the 2020 elections proved can make a big difference. And our government is stronger, more representative, more inclusive, and more fair when more people participate and have their voices heard on Election Day. Common Cause Delaware urges all our legislators to support HB 75. In short, no excuse absentee voting is just good common sense. So let's get it done. Thank you. Now back to you, Dwayne.
Thanks, Claire. That's right. Let's get it done. One group I didn't just mention when I gave the list is Botamos and the We Vote Coalition. Charito Kavachi Mateko meant to be with us this afternoon, but was unable to join. But she would have talked about the importance of advancing access to the ballot for Delaware's Latina and Latino communities. So hopefully we'll have Charito next time and next event. Rural communities are also in need of expanded access to voting, which is why it's really important to our coalition that we have representation from Sussex County. Tom Urban with the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice is joining us. Tom, go ahead and speak to us.
Good afternoon. The Southern Delaware Association Alliance for Racial Justice is pleased to be part of this coalition. We have a broad focus on racial justice, equity, and education. And part of that is participation in our government and our society in general. And we have programs all the time, monthly town halls, lots of education programs, and voting is a key part of that. And Sussex County, as you said, is considered a rural county, but people nowadays think of Sussex County for the beaches, the famous beaches. But what has happened is most people in Sussex County live in small towns. And historically, they worked near where they lived. They worked in agriculture, they worked in commerce, they worked in all sorts of professions. But now people are traveling, they're commuting, just like up in the big city, commuting to work. They would drive from the western side of the county to the eastern side, to the job centers and the beach areas, and work in agriculture, healthcare, hospitality, construction, education, and everything else. And that's particularly in many people who are part of our alliance are also in the sandwich group, where they're taking care of older people and they're taking care of younger people. And it's very hard to go vote in a 12-hour window if you're working 1 or 2 jobs, if you're commuting, if you have a difficulty in terms of a narrow ground for early voting. And so that's particularly true of people of color. And we have a large, both the African-American and Latino population in Sussex County, and working and traveling and being a key part of our community. And so being able to vote more easily, register more easily, and vote more easily is particularly important. and the 12-hour window on a Tuesday in November, it just doesn't make it anymore. And like Ms. Bertelsen, I've got decades of experience in other states that have had universal early voting for decades, where it is safe. Me as an election lawyer, retired now, but where it's safe, 70% or more of the people vote safely, securely, and easily, and are on permanent early voting lists. So they get a ballot mailed to them every election cycle, and it works, and it's easy, simple, and it's as secure as election day voting. And so Delaware needs to move into this world and amend the Constitution. I think Representative Benz stated it exceptionally well. Constitutions aren't for the type of detail in the Delaware Constitution. The legislature can make changes. Now, technology, for example, you don't need to vote in your neighborhood precinct. In many states have voter centers. You walk in, you identify yourself, your ballot is printed for wherever you live. So if it's countywide, you can vote anywhere in your county, and your ballot is printed wherever you go, not your precinct. Because many people get up early, they drive to the other side of the county for jobs, and they can't get home in time to vote. And that's just not right. And so the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice is strongly in support of this effort, and we thank everybody for their participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That's exactly right. Delaware needs to catch up to the voting reforms of the 21st century. We're ready. While other states have been pushing forward on restrictive measures that have a disproportionate impact on communities of color's access to the polls, in Delaware, we're moving forward with expanded access. To talk more about these laws' impacts, we have Dr. Courtney Jordan Cox of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, the Alpha Nu Sigma alumni chapter. Dr. Jordan Cox.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you all. Again, my name is Dr. Courtney Jordan Cox. I'm the Bacillus, or president, of Alpha Nu Sigma chapter of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. Just to give you a little bit of context about what I'm going to speak on, I'll be very brief. But Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, our sorority, was founded by 7 Black educators at the height of racial discrimination in Indiana in 1922. Since then, our sisterhood has expanded to an international organization that is impactful, and social justice and community action are at the core of our mission as we pursue the aims of enhancing the quality of life for everyone. Voting rights and access are a key piece of giving a voice to every single person's needs. The Black community has strived for voting access as a means of both empowerment and justice in pursuit of the American dream for years, decades now at this point. Removing unnecessary barriers to voting will increase voting participation and help us reach our goals of becoming a more just nation that is stronger together. One of the really amazing things about voting is it's one thing that we can all do together, one common collective action that we can make that makes a terrific impact on our society. If we've learned anything over the course of the pandemic, it's the importance of making sure that minority voices are heard and represented so that laws and legislation can be responsive to their issues in a physically and emotionally safe environment. So again, Alpha Nu Sigma chapter is so pleased to sit with our partners in the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, and we look forward to working really hard together on this really important topic.
Thank you, Courtney. We're so excited to have you all as a part of our coalition. And as I mentioned, we do have our representative from the Botamos We Vote coalition, Chirito Calvachi Mateco, is here with us. Chirito?
Yes, I am Chirito Calvachi Mateco, and I'm so proudly the chair of Botamos We Vote. This is a coalition of 13 organizations that are reaching out to this giant, this silent giant that the Latino vote is. It made a difference in the national elections. This past presidential election, it will continue being a voice. There is a majority of new registered voters, young Latinos, that are putting their political power in elections, and they need to be heard. We bring as Latinos a different perspective of a collective society, of knowledge, of land use and nature. That is a perspective that will inform us and educate us to whom we need to vote and for what issues. And also, we bring the historic perspective of all the things that have passed in the different countries of Latin America with the US intervention, that we need to elect people that will make a difference. Even inside the United States, when you think in all the DACA recipients and the parents of those recipients, there is so much that the perspective of who we are will bring to the election process. And I think we have already done. We have made choices as Latinos to elect those that listen to the issues that are going to make this country forward and really what we meant to be as a nation. We have had, and our contributions have been ignored for centuries. 51% of Mexico became 1/3 of what is United States. So, the contributions are tremendous, continue being great and big. And that's why any process of election should include and should take account and involve and engage Latinos.
Thank you, Teresa. We appreciate that. Yes, I think that silent giant is about to be really loud. As JLo says, let's get loud, right? And this Voting Rights Coalition is going to be loud and a powerful force in the state of Delaware as we push forward on these important reforms that we've talked about today, not only the constitutional amendment that we started off with Representative David Bentz, but also increasing registration access and same-day registration, automatic voter registration, and also making sure that we have a vote-by-mail mechanism in the state of Delaware that is permanent and accessible for all voters throughout the state. So at this point, we are ready for our questions. The reason that we have this press conference is to open it up to questions from the press. So we would love to hear any questions that you all have about this very first statewide Voting Rights Coalition that we're excited to announce.
Hi, everybody. If you are a member of the press and would like to ask us a question, just raise your hand and I will temporarily give you panelist privileges to ask your question, and then we'll get it answered.
I think this shows how brilliant the panel we've assembled is, because we've answered all the press aren't shy. I know you all aren't shy. So we must have just done a fantastic job of answering all potential questions. And I do want to thank all the panelists who joined us today. I really appreciate everyone and those that are part of the coalition that aren't a part of today's press conference. It's been a really great pleasure working with everybody throughout the state. Again, any questions that anybody has, please see one attendee has raised their hand.
Mark, you have speaking privileges. Go ahead, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. What assurances do you have that future elections, if this becomes a reality in Delaware, no excuse absentee, would make sure that the people who vote are indeed the ones who are seeking, security, the bottom line? That was also a big concern in addition to turnout in last November's election.
Thank you for that question, Mark. I'm not sure if anybody wants to take that necessarily. I think, certainly the Voting Rights Coalition is also focused on making sure that our vote is secure and safe. And I think that we have good evidence here in Delaware of implementing a vote by mail process that is open to all, that is secure and safe. And now I see Tom raise your hand. Tom, please go ahead and speak further.
Yeah, that's a great question, because people talk about election security all the time. And initially, let me point you to the Heritage Foundation's website. For the last decade or more, they've been tracking voter fraud in the country. They've been looking and looking and looking, and they find none. There is none. And every time there's voter fraud and it's prosecuted anywhere in the country, they list it. And it's basically so minuscule that it doesn't even come up statistically as anything. So we start with the fact that it doesn't exist, but it's very reasonable. And every legislature in the country has passed laws for voter security. And when you do early voting, there's 34 states, as was mentioned earlier, and all of those states have slightly different functions, as different ways of doing it. But in the states that I'm familiar with, there's a commonality. People have to get an early ballot, and it is mailed to them at their address, their registered address. So no one can collect thousands of early ballots without robbing thousands of mailboxes and then having none of those thousands of people reporting that their ballot was missing. Well, that's implausible. It doesn't happen. So, and to forge a ballot, you would have to get the address, forge the ballot, forge a signature, send it in, because signature verification is very, very, very important. So ballot verification and signature verification are done uniformly by election departments. And when they get that, they make sure that it is that person's ballot. And if the signature doesn't match, in most states, there's staff, and there's also members of the major political parties who are appointed by the parties to check those signatures. And they work in a team, Republican and Democrat sitting next to each other. And I had the privilege of being the special counsel to the 4th largest election department in America for many election cycles. And to see a partisan Democrat and a partisan Republican sitting next to each other for hours and hours and hours verifying signatures is a real testament to democracy. And it works. And now there's machines that do it. And we've got now the benefit. So how do we test the system? We've had more than 60 lawsuits in this last election cycle. And in several states, there were evidentiary hearings. There were redones. In Georgia, they had forensic examinations of early ballots. They counted and recounted. They had hand counts. They had machine counts of all the ballots. And the same happened in Arizona, to not 100%, and in some other states, and everything was perfect. So the system, it's a great question, Mr. Fauser, but it is not an issue that can't be dealt with by legislation and by professionals in the election departments and by participation by the political parties in the process, both before the election, during the election, and afterwards, where it's checked and rechecked. And that all proved out in the 2020 cycle, which by all accounts that I can see as decades of a nonpartisan election lawyering in me, was the most secure election in American history, no matter what some headlines say.
Go ahead, Teresa.
From the Latino perspective, we really need to focus in the voter suppression, which is the other side of this. Really, what is affecting our system is voter suppression by the governors. Just see what happened in Georgia. That attends to everybody's supreme right of voting. And for Latinos, having not to have this type of legislation means endless lines and fewer and fewer polling places. So that's what they face. They work hard, so they are not going to be able to be endless hours in a polling place. this legislation give them, the security of being able to be in charge of what they want to do without having to just get discouraged by a system that, that's exactly what we will face without this legislation.
Thank you, Charita. I appreciate those comments. I mean, I think that what we're seeing is these are not mutually exclusive goals, and a safe and secure election and a safe and secure democracy broadens eligibility, accessibility to the polls. And so we really need to make sure we implement these voting reforms that make sure as many people who are eligible to vote can do so without these unnecessary obstacles in their way. I saw a comment on the chat that I really appreciate that we'll go ahead and lift. This person had an illness that didn't permit them in time to vote through the mail. And so it's just so important that we have a consistent, clear voting process for people to obtain their vote by mail ballot ahead of time without the excuse mechanism that may delay their last minute change of plans. And so that's a really important point about why it's so important that we make these changes. The other big change is the early vote opportunity that will happening the first time in 2022. Go ahead, Dr. Jordan Cox.
Just wanted to add also, when I think about how people live in the United States, we have a variety of different lifestyles, and it requires a lot of different things in order for us, each of us, to kind of make it through our lives, pay our bills, take care of our families. And so when I think about voting day, and I think about the long lines that Charito mentioned, I think about the folks that only have 30 minutes for lunch. And I think about the fact that you may be risking something like your job and essentially then your livelihood and ability to pay bills by deciding to exercise your democratic rights. And so that in and of itself is quite disturbing, that we in a technologically advanced society have not managed to figure out as a whole how to overcome that barrier for people who are working really, really hard to keep themselves afloat. And something so simple as having a mail-in ballot could really alleviate that problem for people who work really hard to support themselves and their families and our communities.
Thank you, Courtney. One of the questions we have from our question and answer is about pending legislation eliminating the double registration requirement in some municipalities in the state of Delaware. This is something that has come to the coalition's attention, that some municipalities in Delaware have additional registration requirements. They don't just adopt the statewide system for voter registration. And so those voters within those municipalities have to register both at the municipal level and at the statewide level. I think that there's pending legislation or legislation that will be introduced that would eliminate that double requirement, that would have municipalities pull from the statewide voter registration polls. Claire, do you want to speak more about that?
Sure. We haven't seen the bill yet because it hasn't been filed, but from what I know about it, it's a great idea to eliminate a double registration requirement, because the fact is, when you register to vote in Delaware and you assume that means that you can vote in local elections. And so I know in Rehoboth, a lot of people show up where I live, a lot of people show up and they're ready to vote and they had no idea that there was a second requirement for registration. So that doesn't really make sense. So it's common cause Delaware definitely like to see, the voter roll for the state also apply for municipal elections. But I don't think we've discussed it as a coalition just because the bill hasn't been filed yet.
The Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice also supports the universal registration, because there are lots of people who live in especially African Americans who live in different communities that aren't dual registered. I don't live in Rehoboth, but I live in a place where you have to register to vote in the utility election as well as in the state and county elections. And so that's a very obscure registration, but it's an important part of everyone's life. There was a question by one person about losing a ballot in the mail. which is an important part of the whole notion of people feeling comfortable with it. And the way to deal with that is really simple, is you don't have to mail it. You can drop it off someplace. You can drop it off at a drop box. Drop boxes are very, very safe, and they can be placed, and you can have several weeks to do that. But if there's a scare about that, you can go to the polling place on election day, and then the polling place, they would have noticed that you got an early ballot, but then you would vote provisionally. And then they wouldn't count your vote right away, but in the days following the election, they'd make sure that your mail-in ballot hadn't been mailed in, so that your vote would only count once. So somebody who thought, well, maybe I'll be sick, or maybe I feel insecure, you could actually show up at the polling place. Now, most states have a statute, and this is where Representative Benson, other smart legislators come in, that say if you bring your early voting materials to the polling place and turn them in, that means you haven't mailed it. You can then vote regularly on election day. Provisionally or regularly. It's a very simple fix, but it's a legitimate concern that people have about their ballots getting lost in the mail. And most jurisdictions nowadays, you can check, like I voted by mail this last election, and in Sussex County, I could check, and 2 or 3 days later, it popped up on, I could check and see that my ballot had been received and accepted. That's another way you can see early. So there are many, many ways to stop that concern, which is valid, but to make sure. But I checked every day for several days until it popped up on the screen that my ballot had been accepted. So all of these things can be worked out, and there are more than 30 states that have systems to be followed. Delaware doesn't have to invent a system. And as I said, one of the great inventions the last 20 years with technology is you don't even have to print ballots for each precinct. You can just identify yourself, and the computer will print your ballot. So if Claire, for example, lives in Rehoboth, and she may be in a different jurisdictions for different things, a Claire ballot will pop up. So you don't have to go to a precinct that is in that geographic location, and technology covers that. And that means, for example, African Americans who live on in central Sussex County, who drive to work at the beaches, they could stop in at a polling place at the beaches, their ballot would pop up and they would vote. And that's a reform in addition to early voting that is easy and simple, and actually makes it easier for election officials to do their jobs.
I would like to add something that is even ironic as a Latina coming from Ecuador and now adapting this beautiful country as mine. It is just mind-boggling that we are talking about this. Why? Because in Ecuador, it's supposed to be a so-called third country. Everybody, when they get to be 18, are put by law in the government, in the registration for voting. They know you got 18 and you are included. You don't have to do a thing. You have to go and vote. And it's a celebration. It's on Sunday. So here it is. I am living, and I adapted this beautiful country as mine that is talking about this. It's having this conversation when this is supposed to be the country of democracy in the world. The leader, the model. It really, I don't understand how in this country, everything is easier than ever for voting, for the supreme right of being a citizen, which is to vote for, elect those that you want to be guiding the destiny of your city or your home country.
Thank you, Teresa. That's a great point. And, I just want to elevate that this coalition plans to keep working. HB 75 is one of the first priorities for many of our coalition partners, but we're going to keep working. And once HB 75 is passed, it'll be really important that we make sure that the vote by mail implementing legislation has reforms within it that expand access. And so we're looking at prepaid postage on returnable envelopes to return vote by mail applications and ballots, secure drop boxes widely available in each of the House districts throughout the state of Delaware, phone and online voter assistance hotlines in the predominant languages spoken in Delaware, and a formal process to notify voters before any mail ballot is rejected, so that they're provided the opportunity to correct any of those errors in a timely manner. We know that we have great Department of Elections officials that can take care of these issues for us to make sure that voting is just widely accessible throughout the state of Delaware. Any other questions? If there are folks that are attending that aren't necessarily press and you have a question, please feel free to drop your question in the chat. We're also monitoring our Facebook Live video. Any questions there, we'll also try to answer. Morgan, any other questions you're seeing in the chat?
Nothing on either end right now.
I think I just saw a question from Mark about whether people have had their excuse rejected for an absentee ballot. And I think that that's part of the issue, is that you don't know what you don't know. So there are many people who would otherwise be eligible to vote absentee or register to vote with an absentee ballot in the state, but choose not to because they know that they're not eligible under the current rigid constitutional framework. And so we saw that in the 2020 election when we made it a no excuse situation. Many people opted in who had never before elected to vote with an absentee ballot. So it's really an important mechanism that voters have chosen to use, and we need to make sure is secure in future elections so that we don't have confusion in 2022. You had people that were temporarily eligible to vote with an absentee ballot in 2020, and without HB 75 and implementing legislation in 2022, they would not be eligible. That's going to cause a lot of confusion for voters throughout the state. So it's really important that we make this a permanent opportunity for voters. Thank you all so much for joining us. I want to again thank our panelists and member coalitions. Thank you, Representative Bentz, for joining us. Thank you, members of the media and our Facebook attendees. We're really excited to have this coalition be a presence in the state of Delaware. We're here to stay. We're going to keep pushing forward to make sure Delaware becomes the forefront of voting rights in the nation. And we're really excited about what we're doing. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email me directly at dbensing@aclu-de.org or Morgan Keller. You know how to find us on the ACLU website, where we also have a Delaware Voting Rights Coalition launching page. Excited to have you all here today. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.